am Simone Kotva, an affiliated lecturer at the Faculty of Divinity, and this is my short talk on environmentalism and the art of attention. There are many reasons why environmentalism fails and continues to fail despite the escalating planetary emergency. Many of these reasons are internal to environmentalism itself and are connected to the ideals shaping it. As such, they're tricky to identify, much less to examine and act upon. Take, for instance, the idea that we need to pay more attention to our surroundings, that we suffer today from an attention deficit disorder that is also a nature deficit disorder. This idea, which is also an ethical and spiritual ideal, was popularized by Richard Louve's 2005 title, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. But it is invoked too by several philosophers, among them Isabel Stengers, with whose work I will be engaging in this short talk. At first blush, the encouragement to pay more attention seems straightforward enough. If lack of care for this life world is a reason why industrialized societies are able to exploit it as we do, then paying more attention would address this lack of care. Since attention is a form of care, it is the practice of watching out for something, of attending. But attention has many faces, and not all of them kind. As Stengers argues in her essay, Catastrophic Times, Resisting the Coming Barbarism, what we have been ordered to forget is not the capacity to pay attention, but the art of paying attention. What we have been ordered to forget is not the capacity to pay attention, but the art of paying attention. So this distinction between attention as capacity and as art is important. It traces a line between cause and cure. Considered as capacity, attention is the ability, particularly well developed in hominids, to focus the mind at will on a few things to the exclusion of others. Above all, attention is what allows us to be fascinated and take an interest in things and ideas that are not strictly necessary for survival. That interest results in the innocuous heaps of pretty shells and tumbled glass that adorn childhood bedrooms, but it also, and less innocently, has been responsible for the practice of filling glass cabinets with stuffed organisms and looted artifacts collected at great cost to original habitats and surroundings and peoples. Thanks to scholars like Carolyn Merchant and Catherine Youssoff, the key role played by early iterations of modern science in paving the way for the environmental crisis is well known, as is the role played by colonialism in facilitating the exploitation of natural and cultural resources, without which the Anthropocene would have been mostly unthinkable. The key arguments in this story are well presented in Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin's The Human Planet, How We Created the Anthropocene. In this way, and considered as a capacity, attention has played a huge and hugely under-acknowledged role in overheating this planet. A host of vital feelings and crucial cares, compassion, decency, interspecies companionship, should have tugged at attention and distracted it from its foci, but they did not. In this instance, the fact that creatures were literally dying as a result of the attentions paid them seemed of little consequence. There is a passage in one of Isabel Stengers' recent essays, Another Science is Possible, Manifesto for a Slow Science, where she describes the predicament I've been sketching above, but instead of making a distinction between attention and distraction, she writes about two modes of attention, two forms of practicing attention, fast and slow. Fast attention corresponds to what I've just described as the effect of focusing on one thing to the exclusion of others, or having a short-term focus. Stengers compares it to the attitude of a mobilized army of men at war. Whatever villages and fields are ravaged as a result of the army's forward march makes no difference to its ideal of progress. So the horrific carbon footprint accrued when we travel halfway across the globe to gaze enraptured at landscapes and creatures, or enjoy leisurely recreation in untouched wilderness, is the most obvious example of how attention that is fixed on single short-term goals to the exclusion of long-term concerns lead to injustice, even, not to say especially, when such activities are undertaken in the name of a general love for nature. To take another well-publicized example, in Sweden, environmental literacy is extremely high, and yet the country is among the top nations consuming less sustainably. A recent poll showed that what Swedes save by switching to green sources of energy, they typically spend on tourism and recreation in remote beauty spots. An even more extreme case is Norway, where the building of holiday cottages in undisturbed areas threatens the very biomes of the ecosystems celebrated by holidaymakers. It's a good example of environmental literacy and attention to place, ironically contributing directly to its exploitation. There is an obvious analogy here to be drawn with capitalism. Capitalism has been called the economy of attention par excellence, focusing all resources on a few short-term goals to the exclusion of a multiplicity of interconnected long-term concerns. For precisely the same reason, however, capitalism has also been described as an economy that destroys attention, since capitalism's emphasis on speed inhibits practices that demand a slower tempo, such as care. As Bernard Stiegler writes, the current crisis is, quote, the disastrous result of the hegemony of the short term, of which the destruction of attention is at once effect and cause. So thinking with this paradox of attention, Stengers argues that what we need to do now is not to stop paying attention, but to demobilize our style of attention by slowing it down. Crucially, and this is where her description of slow attention, I think, overlaps with distraction, for Stengers, slowness allows attention to be open and receptive, able to be surprised by what may lurk, as she puts it in a recent interview, an ability that Stengers argues is at stake not only for ecological thinking, but also for a host of mystical, animist, and indigenous traditions, many of them still excluded from the canon of what passes for intellectual respectability. So considered as an art, then, attention is the skill of being open, but not only to places, creatures, and things, but also to those worldviews, forms of life, and ways of thinking that may facilitate such openness in the first place. As E.O. Wilson has argued, the best and perhaps the only realistic response to ecosystem degradation is to remove urbanized humans from the equation as far as possible. The so-called half-Earth theory forecasts a future where most humans live in cities and the countryside is populated by those who have actual business there, farmers, animals, and so forth. The fact is that the environment can look after itself and does not need input from us in order to repair itself adequately. In other words, it doesn't need human attention, at least not the kind of fast attention it so often receives in the context of capitalism. Of course, the idea of living in a city without being able to escape regularly to the countryside or commute to one's country house sounds monstrous, but that has more to do with the state of contemporary cities and prevailing attitudes than it has to do with urban environments as such, with what they could be. As the novelist and eco-critic Kim Stanley Robinson remarks, when we find ourselves unable to indulge our attention in the countryside as an escape, we may become finally able to be distracted sufficiently by the cares of our immediate environments, the well-being of our neighbours, the well-being of neighbouring biomes, the state of the sewers. But this can only happen if our modality of attention shifts from capacity to art. As long as our attention is focused elsewhere than on our immediate surroundings, whatever efforts we put into protecting remote wetlands and red-listed species, as important as such concerns are, they will fail to make an impact on the global situation. Indeed, they will lead to counterproductive rebound effects, as is the case in the well-known examples from Scandinavia that I cited earlier. Even so, I find myself returning continually to attention as a capacity. There is something here to which I'm drawn. Perhaps it is because the effect of what Stengers calls fast attention, the destructive attention, the effect of it on the nervous system mimics the effect of certain enhancing drugs and can suppress awareness of vital bodily functions. This is a common sensation among writers and researchers. While attention is high, one feels physically high, less aware of the body, less able to be distracted by bodily factors such as temperature, hunger, and pain. Now, that ability to block out vital functions can be useful, but it can also be harmful, and it is only useful in the short term. If the body is coming to serious harm as a result of attention, if it dies even, arguably the activity is not particularly beneficial. That romanticism has taught us to admire such deaths compounds the problem. We secretly desire to go out on a high. But when the body is the world in all its variegated multifarious life, and mass extinction its death, we must ask ourselves whether this particular high is worth the price we are paying for it. Perhaps it is time then that we learnt, along with the art of attention, the art of being distracted by what matters. Thank you very much for your time.